Hello, Socrates at SaddleBrooke. Welcome to number 7 in our 2-season investigation of the big question, has science rediscovered a creator? In this next to the last presentation, I cover a really challenging topic from a scientific standpoint. Who or what is God? What comes to your mind when you think about God as the creator? How does the culture view God and science today? What are the various worldwide worldviews of God? What historically has been the relationship between God and science? And what has happened in the last 50 years of scientific investigation to bring God back into the scientific discussion? That's where we're going today. So get ready for my presentation at the Socrates Forum in SaddleBrooke, Arizona. But before we do, I bet you're really surprised to see me back in my white lab coat at the Institute. It's bizarre, I know, that I'm back. But this is the department I started in astrophysics, before I got transferred to astrobiology, where all that trouble began. You might remember in my video cast on human evolution that I exposed the junk DNA myth in public too many times, and that was just too much for my supervisor to take. And he eventually found a way to let me go, as they say. But that's how it is in biology. In physics, they are much more used to being challenged by metaphysical implications. In physics, we're used to working with boundaries. We're interested in and knowledgeable about working with initial conditions. You can't avoid metaphysical ideas. You know, why is there something rather than nothing? How did the universe begin? What happened the day before the Big Bang? When did it all start? Who's behind it all? What's behind it all? In physics, you start with a big picture and you work your way down from that. In biology, many times you just keep on deconstructing things and reducing them to minutia detail and miss the big picture. So you may recall my earlier video casts about I worked on the beginning of the universe and planet Earth, and that wasn't bothering anybody. But when I started working in astrobiology on the origin of life questions, and I understood the living cell, my eyes were opened. I had an aha moment. I mean, in evolutionary biology, we only consider materialistic explanations. Working with metaphysical boundaries was something we really tried to avoid. Remember when I was talking about the so-called DNA theory that was proven wrong by the ENCODE consortium? Most of that so-called DNA was shown to be functional just several years later. What a revelation that was to me. But my department head wanted me to remain mum about it in my public presentations, and I just couldn't go along with that groupthink. When I started holding off-site presentations about junk DNA from a top-down perspective, I soon discovered a whole new scientific paradigm and approach to the problem. I saw it as a result of intelligent design. The cell had design and purpose. When the buzz about my talk started going around and the audience started getting bigger, it became an embarrassment to him, and he gave me a cease and desist order. But I just couldn't comply, and I was eventually canned. But I was ecstatic about being freed from forced dogma. As you know, if you've been watching the series, I became an independent researcher. I had great clients, good money, but I also discovered that I'm not an independent entrepreneur, which you have to be. So I recently bumped into my old astrophysics boss, Jim Palmer, at the Casey's Pub. And he told me he heard I had left, but he also mentioned that he had an opening on his staff that I would be a perfect fit for. Well, I decided, went home and talked to Gail, and we decided it was a good idea to get back on a steady paycheck again. So here I am again in my white lab coat, and Jim doesn't care two hoots about my metaphysical leanings or my religious convictions. So I'm continuing my off-campus SaddleBrooke forum series on Has Science Rediscovered a Creator, and without any issues so far. Who knows where I'll be in a couple months, but I have been attracting a good following. But more importantly, and this is what's really important, is I know that my intelligent design perspective, my top-down perspective, is going to have a positive impact on the scientific research here at the Institute. And I think in science research in this country in general. So next month I'll be starting up again on the Socrates Forum at the SaddleBrooke Country Club. If you're anywhere in the area, I encourage you to come see me. The next season is going to be even a deeper dive into the origin issues. I'll be starting with the beginning of the universe again and the various current theories of how all that happened, both from a materialistic and from a metaphysical perspective. I'll deal with where most materialists are today in favoring a multiverse hypothesis. And Stephen Hawking's quantum cosmology are the two most popular theories in that area. But I'll also be comparing them to what I think are more promising theories, intelligent design, and the God hypothesis, which is, by the way, being very well articulated by New York Times best-selling author Stephen Meyer's latest book by the same name. But for now, here is the concluding presentation to our current series, What or Who is God? I love that movie, Rudy. You recall that when Rudy went to see the Catholic priest? I love that show. And he says, one thing I know after 30 years of studying theology is there is a God and I'm not him. So, oh, well, thank you for coming for this closing session of Socrates. We had 2 years of interesting investigation because in the last 50 years or so, scientific information has come in to completely reverse where everything was 50 years ago in the mid-60s when Time magazine declared that God is dead. All of a sudden, there's all this information that says, you know, maybe there is a creator. And it's scientific. I mean, these aren't this isn't theological information or philosophical information. This is actual hard science. So we took that on as the Socrates team, and because we're interested in this kind of thing. Where do we come from? Makes a difference if there's a God or isn't a God, right? You ever ask, you know, if there isn't, what do I do? If there is, what do I do? So I'm going to start off with something you guys might have seen before in the movies. I love this dialogue between Morgan Freeman and Jack Nicholson. Gil, you going to get the hot dogs out? This is really interesting. What comes to your mind? What comes to your mind when you think about God? Do you think about God? What comes to mind? Here's the kind of things I think of, and I've been thinking about for a long time now. Why is there something rather than nothing? You ever think about that? To what or whom do I owe my existence? What is it from which everything else comes? What's behind it all? Remember the Wizard of Oz? Pull back the curtain. Was there a Wizard of Oz back there? Is there ultimate reality? Or is this just all there is? The wheels on the bus keep on going around. You live, you die, and the wheels on the bus just keep going round and round. Is there absolute truth anywhere? You know, we entered the 18th century, the Enlightenment period, where human reason was to take over from any kind of theological speculation or theological premises. No absolute truth. We live in a world of relativism. Your truth, my truth, your truth. I mean, that's fine until you run into somebody like Hitler. Is his truth truth? Is there any absolutes anywhere? As I asked myself in my mid-30s, what's it all about, Alfie? And I went on an exploration. If you ask today's scientific authorities, this is pretty much the official line from the Academy. Deny the existence of God is a scientific question. You can have faith, you can have your own personal faith. Just don't bring it to work with you on Monday morning if you work in the Academy. there's nothing but the laws of physics. It's all material. Remember Carl Sagan we talked about. The universe, it's all there is, all there ever was. There's nothing outside the universe. No creator. Because of that, we have to deny human free will and existence of a soul or a spirit. Remember dualism? We dualists believe that there's physical and spiritual nature to us. And you have to deny that the human mind is something more than just a meat computer. Sounds silly, doesn't it? But our ethics departments in Ivy League universities will say, you are nothing, your brain is nothing but a meat computer. Well, we go to the popular culture. Let's ask the popular culture what they think about what God is. God's irrelevant. In fact, he's even the cause of our problems. Get rid of God, get rid of religion. As our famous Richard Dawkins says, faith is one of the world's great evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. It's pretty harsh language. But this is what the New Atheist movement, these are titles, I have them in my library, been through them. The God delusion. God is not great. Breaking the spell of religion. Letter to a Christian nation. God, the failed hypothesis. Well, we'll go to the popular media. We turn on the television, we like PBS, we believe in NPR, the Nova series, the Cosmos series was reinstituted a few years back. The cosmos is all there is. Well, that's one point of view, but the other point of view that they bring out in the Cosmos series is that faith, people of faith, this is anti-science. Faith is anti-science. I watched a program the other night on PBS called The Brain. I love aspects of what is consciousness and what we know about the brain, neuroscience, and so forth. And this is how it starts off. We used to think that mankind had a spiritual nature, but now we know better. Now we know it's just electrons in motion. And we're measuring them. Not only do we know it's only electrons in motion, we're measuring them, and just give us a few more centuries or a few more decades, and we'll figure it all out. So what's been the impact of this? I mean, this movement, especially the New Atheist movement, has had quite an impact on our young people, especially in colleges. And over the last 20 years now, these titles have come out, and this is the kind of talk that goes on. And now the largest religious denomination, if you want to count it as religious denomination, is N-O-N-E-S, nuns, over 30% of the people. Remember, and I'm not making any judgments on this, I'm just saying that this is actually what's happening in society, that 30% of the people will check unaffiliated, religiously unaffiliated. I'm a skeptic, I'm an agnostic, and it's a product of the secular society. So, I mean, I have to ask myself a question. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're right. I mean, maybe people of faith like myself, maybe I just don't know enough. Is God even relevant in this modern age now? I mean, look at the amazing technology that science has produced, and we all are a beneficiary of it. And I said, perhaps maybe the concept of God is outdated. Has modern science actually buried God? Or is there sufficient scientific evidence? I'm not even talking about theological arguments or going to church or synagogue or mosque. Is there sufficient scientific evidence to justify even a God hypothesis? You know, the scientific method is a wonderful method. You can come up with any hypothesis. Jack Nicholson said, sugar plum fairy wall. All right, well, let's say, is Santa Claus the creator of the universe? That's a legitimate scientific hypothesis. But we can test it pretty quickly. You know, where is Santa Claus? Who is Santa Claus? Scientific method says, throw a hypothesis out there and test it. So is there sufficient scientific evidence to justify a God hypothesis? And that's the question we took on for the last 2 years at the Socrates forums. We surveyed the scientific evidence of the last 50 years. We looked at the intersection of science and faith. We looked at the universe, planet Earth, origin of life, origin of the species, human beings. Today we're investigating God. And what we're examining for is what direction do we think the evidence points? I mean, you can't prove that there's a God or no God. But you can collect evidence and you can say, does it point this way? Does it point that way? And that's been our Socrates investigation for the last couple of years. We examine the evidence, asking which way it points. So today we're at number 7, the last category, what or who is God? And we've arrived at some conclusions, which we'll talk about at the end. And we want to take this investigation to the next level in Socrates 3 season, which begins in October. But you have a real jewel here because all this information is right on that website, right there. You sign on to the website, there's over 20 presentations of the Socrates Forum, and you can dig into any one of these categories of what we've discovered so far. In fact, there's about 4 more, I guess, we need to produce over the summer. Okay, well, let's define what we mean by God. First thing, we have to have definitions. Usually there's 3 broad categories of what people mean by God. Now, a lot of variations on these categories. These are big circles, but the material world is all there is. That's materialism. That's the Carl Sagan hypothesis. That's the current scientific academy's definition. Basis of materialism. So it's an atheistic philosophy. The second one is there is a transcendent immaterial creator. This has been the basis of Western religion for hundreds of years right now. There is a transcendent immaterial creator, which is the basis of Western theism. And then there's the Eastern philosophy and Eastern religions, which says, yes, there's an immaterial dimension to everything, and a material dimension, but they're all one. It's all the same. It's the basis of what is called pantheism. Pan means the Greek word for everything. It's pretty hard to diagram this, but I just, with my analytical brain, I have to say, how do I diagram this? Well, I put everything in, if it's just the material world, that's all there is, right? There's space, time, matter, energy, natural law all inside the green box there. Then we come to a metaphysical boundary. What does that mean? Well, meta means beyond. So physics, is there a physical beyond that boundary? Materialism says no. Everything is contained in that box. But if we go to the left of the screen there, as theism believes that there's an outside creator outside the box, that's theism. If we go to the right side, there's no physical boundary. Everything flows from the box to the outside. There's no creator. And the immaterial world and the material world are one. We're not going to really get into that because what we're looking for is evidence for a creator this way or no creator that way. That's really our thrust here. Why is this question even important? I mean, a lot of people, you're not included because you guys want to know more. You guys come to talks like this and you want to figure this out. Why is this question important? Well, because Socrates says, and we believe that the unexamined life is hardly worth living. If we just go through the same thing day after day, what's it all about? Where's this going? So we seek to answer the question of the Creator because everything of importance rests on that. I mean, that's kind of like a foundational question, whether or not God exists. So in Western traditional theism, what do I mean by God? And I'm going to use this definition. What do I mean by God? Well, supreme being. I hope we heard Jack Nicholson say that. You mean you said to Morgan Freeman, you mean you believe there's a supreme being? Yeah? He said, I have faith. We mean that there's a creator of all things, yeah? That he's transcendent, out there, yet personal, yet I have a relationship. Actually, it's an unembodied mind. It's an immaterial mind when we talk about theism. Is this something in the universe? No. Something that created the universe. So the question of who created God is an immaterial question. It's an irrelevant question because this God is self-existent and eternal. And it has all the omnis that we know about. All-knowing, all-present, all-powerful, infinitely good and unchanging. So
Anyway, that's what I'm going to be meaning by God. I'm going to do a thought experiment here with you to introduce this topic. Let's pretend we're given a black box, any kind of black box. I have it here on our lap. We have a black box. Now, we didn't create, I didn't create this box, so you don't know what's inside it until only the creator of the black box knows what it is, right? The creator's outside the box. But we need to open the box to find out what's in it and how it works. I mean, that's what science does. It analyzes, it collects information, collects evidence, and comes up with the best explanation. That is the scientific method. So let's pretend now that what's inside the box is the universe. My goodness. The universe. Wow, what do we find in there? Well, we see the stars at night and the galaxies, and that's all part of it. See the sun during the day, transit the heavens. Planet Earth. We look at planet Earth and we go, wow, that's a pretty complicated thing. We see life. Where did life come from? Non-life. How did it come from non-life? All the varieties of life. How did they come from? Where did they come from? Human beings are the most complicated. 3 pounds sitting up here that they showed on that PBS special the other night. 3 pounds, most complicated instrument in the whole universe. So we collect evidence and we start sorting through this evidence, and we say, which direction does it point? Does it point toward a creator or not to a creator? Or in pantheism, there's no distinction between the two, so we don't ask that question. As Freeman and Nicholson saw, there's a huge disconnect here. Freeman says, 90% of the world's population believes in God, and Nicholson says, well, 90% of the people are always wrong, right? But, people seem hardwired for faith. I mean, even young children, there's some interesting studies done by this Alison Gopnik at UC Berkeley, where young children, even if they're raised in atheistic families, they think about a supreme being. I mean, they look at a butterfly and they think, well, that's created. They don't think that happened by random chance. But on the other side, 90% of our U.S. Academy of Natural Sciences, the same in Britain and most of the Western world now are atheists. Perhaps that's because the evidence actually points to atheism. Maybe they're right. Maybe neither one of us are right. But the cultural narrative tells us that science and God are incompatible domains. I'll read this. To be modern, if I want to be modern, thoroughly modern stew, I have to be educated, intellectual and rational, and especially if I want to be scientific, and I must break the chains of religion and dogma, study the natural world without any presumption of God. All right, so I'm going to break the chains. I mean, that doesn't mean I have to give up my faith. It means I just break the chains of anything. So any hypotheses that has to do with God, you have to leave that at home. Keep your faith to yourself. You must assume materialism as your default scientific position and atheism as your religious position. We even have a name for this. It's called methodological naturalism. What does that mean? Well, naturalism means nature is all there is. It's the same thing as materialism. And methodological means whatever method you use in the sciences, you better just do physics and chemistry, and now even biology. There's an irony here, a real irony, because there's a fear that somehow if we introduce theology or the idea of God into the scientific process, we're going to go back to the sugar plum fairy days that Nicholson talked about, and just tent revivals and all this kind of thing. But you know that modern science was actually born out of a theistic worldview? It wasn't born out of an atheistic worldview. It was the Judeo-Christian worldview of the 17th century that gave us the scientific method, summed up in a verse. I'll pick one verse out of the Bible there. The heavens declare the glory of God, and their voice is going out through all the earth. Science was born in 17th century Europe with this biblical worldview. Why there? Why then? You ever think about that? I mean, why not with the Greeks? I mean, it goes back to the Greeks, 5th century BC, 2nd century, all the great academies of philosophy. Why wasn't the scientific method born there? They started with it. I mean, they started with the ideas and so forth, but they didn't complete the cycle of the scientific method. Why not the Romans? I mean, the Romans had superior engineering. They built incredible bridges, roads, Pax Romana. Why not Egypt? My goodness, how'd they build those pyramids? And I don't think it was space aliens, okay? Some of the programs talk about amazing technology they had. Why not China, for Pete's sake? I mean, they're really inventive. They invented the compass way before anybody thought about it. They invented gunpowder. Here's why. And this is not just religious historians of science. Atheistic historians of science will confirm that this is the most likely reason, this is the logic behind why 17th century Europe. Technology had evolved to the point, at that point in time, where the telescope was invented, 1608. Copernicus was about 50 years before that, and Copernicus is the first one that thought, well, maybe it's not that the sun goes around the earth, maybe the earth goes around the sun, but he didn't have the technology, he didn't have the telescope at that time. But by the time Galileo was born and the telescope comes along, wow, they're putting those two together. The Europeans also had the Gutenberg Bible, and they believed in a creator. The universe was orderly, intelligible, and contingent. What's contingent mean? It means it was based on assumptions. Why was the universe that way rather than some other way? Europeans were driven now to use this new technology to discover their place in the Creator's universe. They looked up. Their theistic worldview actually led them to the invention of the scientific method. They saw that nature was designed by a mind, this is what they believed, that nature was designed by a mind that had a purpose. Mankind was made in God's image. That was taught to them in their Bible. They studied the heavens with a telescope to help them pursue the call, because the Bible said, God says to this people, he said, seek me and you will find me. They believed that. So they pointed the telescope to the heavens. And all the founders of the scientific revolution were believing, strong Christian believers. Copernicus, before the telescope, Galileo comes along and says, you know, the first telescope was only like 3 power. They put 2 lenses together almost by accident and saw, wow, look at that. We can use that on board ships to see the enemy ship coming. 3 power. Galileo says, well, let's do it a little bit better. Let's make it stronger than that, and let's look up at the sky. And in 1610, he writes his memoirs there. All we had before that were the Greek ideas that the universe was somehow a perfect philosopher from a philosophical standpoint. But Galileo said, no, I'm going to do some research. And he saw the moons on Jupiter, and he said, all these little things going around Jupiter. He said, wow, that has moons. That's a planet. The phases of Venus, like we see in the evening sky. The imperfection on the moon wasn't perfectly flat and smooth as the Greeks thought. And he publishes all this in 1610 in something called the Starry Messengers. Kepler comes along and with his mathematical mind says, I'm going to figure out how all this stuff moves. I'm going to come up with mathematical equations. He discovers the laws of planetary motion and publishes them. And then perhaps the greatest scientist of all time, even Einstein would acknowledge Isaac Newton, comes along with his Principia, which is an amazing amount of work, discovers the laws of gravitation and the laws of motion and so forth. And he took his theological perspective to encourage him to come up with these theories. So their theology informed their science. And since everything was designed, this is what they thought, everything being designed by a rational God, they expected to be able to use their minds to connect with God's minds, and maybe by observing the creation up close with the telescope, we're going to learn something. We all know that we're made for discovery. I mean, mankind is made for discovery. Why do we climb mountains? Because it's there. Why do we go to the moon? Because it's there. Why do we try to run a 350 minute mile rather than a 4 minute? Because it's there. They knew they had the technology and the mathematics. You ever think about why mathematics even works? I mean, that's pretty incredible. How can you write formulas down on a piece of paper and actually use it to go to the moon? Newton, for example, only had algebra at that time. And he said, you know, for planetary motion, I need to come up with mathematics that talks about change over time. So he invents something called the calculus. Pretty smart guys. They all spoke multiple languages too. And then they asked, this is a really interesting part about the scientific method, they asked, why this particular design rather than some other design? Well, no easy answer to that one. So they knew that they had to do their experiments over and over and over and over again, and they would eventually converge on some answers and test and measure what they wanted to come up with. Kepler put it this way. He said, science, they didn't even really call it science in his days, but they called it philosophy, natural philosophy. Science is the process of thinking God's thoughts after him. That's what motivated his exploration. So the Bible in those days informed their approach. Here's other ways that informed their approach. They believed that they had flawed abilities because of what the scriptures called original sin. So they concluded that they have to hold their observations tentatively and keep on testing them. And keep on testing them, always being subject to verification, always being ready for improvement. The scientific method was born. The scientific revolution began. Science and faith informed one another. So this is kind of irony, isn't it? Today's science and religion compared to how science and religion started just a few hundred years ago. But here's what we all dread, right? Those were individuals. Those were individuals. What happens when it becomes institutionalized? And we all think the same thing. All of a sudden it starts going downhill. Human organizations take over, the battles begin, and we have church versus science. This is what you usually hear from those that want to discredit one side or the other. Church versus science, science versus the church, Catholics versus Protestants. Here's even people with the same Christian beliefs killing each other mercilessly for 30 years during that was pretty degrading for that to take place. So philosophers to the rescue in the 18th century. They've had enough of the institutionalized science versus religion, so they're going to solve the problem. These are people like Voltaire and Hume and Comte, and human reason now is more reliable. They're deciding human reason is more reliable. You ever think, is man basically, and women, basically good or bad? Not asking for a show of hands here, but think about that. In the 18th century, they concluded, based on rationality, that every day and every way we're getting better and better. Every day and every way we're getting better and better. A lot of people still believe that mankind is basically good. All he needs is more money, more education, more understanding, and so forth. That kind of philosophy held very well up until World War I. And then World War II. 100 million people murdered in the 20th century. Anyway, in the beginning, in the Enlightenment periods, supposedly man is good in every way, and we just keep on encouraging man. Get rid of those theological propositions. Get rid of theologically based morality. So the 18th century is this what we call the Enlightenment era. The Enlightenment era is God is increasingly unnecessary. So all gaps in science. I mean, science has gaps, right? know one thing and we project something else and we prove it, and then we fill in a gap, and then we fill in another gap, and so forth. And these gaps of knowledge are being filled in by science and by technology. So we're saying, boy, we don't need any theology anymore, any theological support. In fact, the philosophers took it to the point, like Hume took it to the point where miracles aren't possible. Why aren't they possible? Did you prove they're not possible? No. Why are they not possible? Because it violates natural law. What does that mean? Because that means that natural law is the absolute standard, and anything that doesn't come in on the natural law must be a violation. So you want to know how miracles started disappearing from people's vocabulary? That's the Enlightenment era. This keeps on going into the 19th century when gaps are filled in by science. It's wonderful, doing a wonderful job. And 19th century, we go from what was called natural philosophy or natural theology. There was a lot of clergymen that were scientists back in the 18th century. And in the 19th century, all of a sudden it becomes very atheistic. The last vestige of science to hold out from any kind of theological input was biology. Biology. And why? Because look around. I mean, you are designed. People are designed. The dog is designed. That's what we naturally just thought. All of a sudden, Darwin comes up with a completely naturalistic theory for the origin of living things, and that becomes, for the atheistic side, that becomes the final blow to theology being informing science. By the mid-20th century, it's called Darwinian evolution. We've been through several sessions on that. Even though there's no direct evidence for evolution, a lot of evidence around the issue, but no direct. It became scientifically acceptable. That's really an interesting story. In fact, Darwin his theory almost disappeared in the beginning of the 20th century. But a lot of biology was done, and it becomes acceptable, and Darwinian evolution raised biology to the status of the hard sciences. It became accepted like physics and chemistry. And then by the mid-60s, this was really at its peak. Theologians started swinging over and making evolution and biblical creation compatible, calling it theistic evolution. And in the 20th century, we get to almost everything is explained by evolution. Survival of the fittest. Every social institution is going to get better and better and better over time. The weak are going to be weeded out. The strong are going to survive. Naturalism is going to take place. And we began a grand era in the mid-20th century, and that culminated in this. And we've seen this one before, in the mid-60s. God is dead. Philosophers said that, Nietzsche said that 50, 60 years before, but by April 8th, 1966, Time magazine actually declares God dead, asked it as a question, but really said that Darwinian evolution is a fact. And the verdict is in. Man is the result of purposeless natural process that did not have him in mind. But here's what's interesting that's happened in the last 50, 70 years. The closing decades of the 20th century, all of a sudden these unexpected scientific discoveries come pointing in the opposite direction. Start pointing in the direction of a creator. There's scientific evidence for a creator. Unfortunately, it's kept off the table. What do I mean by that? Well, it's not, I'll quote, allowed in the academy. It's not allowed in the schools. We don't talk about it. We can talk about it in groups like this as long as we keep it to ourselves. And what are these amazing scientific discoveries? Well, you've heard of every one of them. They all have very interesting theological implications. Special and general theory of relativity. That led to an amazing discovery that the universe was expanding. And all of a sudden, instead of the universe being infinitely old, it had a beginning point. Whoa. Quantum mechanics, we talked about local and non-local events, where two events that happen that are separated by, doesn't make any difference how long, how far separated. They know what's going on. The local and the non-local coordinate somehow. Big Bang cosmology. There's a creation event. We never had any scientific evidence about a creation event before. Something called the anthropic principle. It's amazing. We looked at almost anything now, and it's extremely fine-tuned to survive. That includes Earth is extremely fine-tuned for life to exist. Paleontology. We thought that Darwin's tree of life would be vindicated because small changes accumulated over time, which was what Darwin's theory is, would be vindicated by the fossil record. Instead, what do we find? No, we find big bangs of creation. We find event here, and nothing in between. So it doesn't support natural selection. Epigenetics, we've heard for decades now, and how wonderful. We went into DNA and what DNA does and so forth, but it's not enough. It's just a small portion of who we are. It builds proteins in our body. It doesn't build, there's epigenetics, beyond genetics, what takes over is building. Origin of life research, my goodness. Origin of life research, you see, we've made amino acids in a test tube. That's nothing. It's the sequence of the amino acids that make a sense. Where does the sequence come from? It comes from information. Where does the information come from? Information science, computer technology, all this is being integrated. The sciences of neuroscience is the science of intelligent design. So today, materialism is seriously challenged. The universe is not infinitely old. It had a beginning, point of creation. Planet Earth is so intricately fine-tuned that it could not possibly be the result of nothing but chance and evolution. It's not an accident. There's something going on. There's a design to it, a blueprint to it. Consciousness, as we talked about in a couple of our sessions, is something more than just electrical signals in our brain. The mind is not the brain. And then the interesting thing on the other side, collecting the evidence for Darwinian evolution, there's little observable evidence to support it. We have no idea how life originated. The common ancestry tree of life that Darwin tells us about is replaced by abrupt appearances in the fossil record of new body plans and parts. It's more like a forest or a lawn where everything is erupting over time. How did that happen? It certainly goes against the tree of life. The central dogma that Francis Crick came up with in the 50s was amazing. DNA makes RNA, makes proteins, makes us. That's way less efficient than it needs to be for genetics. We need epigenetics. Natural selection, which is Darwin's main mechanism, has been shown to be woefully inadequate. Survival of the species is not sufficient. And at the same time, there's a new science called intelligent design. I shouldn't even call it a new science. How do you recognize design in anything? This is a very supported science now, of mathematically even. And it's about information and systems biology. In fact, biology now is much better served by looking at a top-down approach. Like, well, if it was designed and there's a blueprint for it, it should have these kind of engineering characteristics, rather than just bottom-up of how it came the Darwinian way. So many of aspects of nature are much better explained by intelligent design. Well, why don't we hear about this much? Why don't I turn on my PBS station and see this station, see a lecture like this? It's a good question. Well, because the Academy, remember, is dominated by a philosophy, and this philosophy is called materialism. It rejects out of hand, any theories that have a theistic implication. It's called methodological naturalism, and it reigns supreme in the sciences. And it's indoctrinated into our next generation. So our kids don't hear about this. There's been a couple of lawsuits that have been brought, and it's almost by school districts that want to say, well, I just want to have something in the library that the kids can read, that there's something going on that Stu's talking about here. Won't happen. You'll be slammed with a lawsuit right away. Methodological naturalism is a sure domination now through the legal, political, and economic structure. This is one that bothers me, this top one here. Listen, maybe Darwinism could be true. It sure doesn't seem that way to me. But whether it's true or not doesn't seem to be of concern. It can be declared true by the power structure. So there's no competition. And at the same time, the Darwinian infrastructure, all the scientific foundation of it, is disintegrating. Even as its most ardent supporters, and we've talked about the Royal Society meeting in 2016 and subsequent engineering proposals, which have nothing to do with theology, there's a call to either replace Darwinism entirely, at least modify it. And at the same time, design theory has been really developing very well, and at the same time, it's not even allowed to the table. The science and faith environment is dramatically improving because of you. You come to a session like this and you hear it. You're not going to hear it other places. You're not going to hear it by turning on your TV set. You're not going to hear it. A lot of books. I mean, I have a number of books out there, but in general, people don't read books. They look to the culture for their information. So evolution is being replaced, modified. Do you know about that? Yeah, well, it is. Intelligent design was initially a grassroots movement. Now it's becoming mainstream science. Small group sessions like this are going on all over the country. Science, the beauty of science will eventually adapt to the new evidence. I mean, you can't hide from the data. The data is there and it eventually wins out. Why do I even go into this? Why is this a big question? Why is this important? Well, we're here because we believe that the unexamined life is not worth living. Does it make a difference if you knew you were created for a purpose rather than you're an accidental byproduct of nature? Does that make a difference in your life? Are you interested in finding an answer to that question? I know I was. Now, I want to go over 3 stumbling blocks that I consider stumbling blocks to progress in this area of science and faith. I call them the God of the Gaps fallacy, NOMA, the non-overlapping magisteria. This sounds very, very sophisticated, but you'll understand what it is when I talk about it. And something called theistic evolution. All right, grab your chair, and here we go. God of the Gaps fallacy. Remember, there's gaps in science, gaps of knowledge. And you can either fill those in with an assumption that there's a material explanation for it. You can fill it in that there's a theological explanation for it. Or you can just examine the evidence and ask yourself, which direction does it point? That to me seems to be the most rational way of going about this whole thing. But people on the materialistic side do not like anything that in their mind smacks of a metaphysical explanation. In other words, if it's outside the box and it has to do with a creator, it's branded religion. That's how the lawsuits come down. Branded as religion, rather than a legitimate theological, philosophical discussion of a non-material thing going on, like a mind. Like a mind, okay. So God of the gap fallacy is used by materialists to discredit competing claims by folks that like the idea to point to design. That has been designed. Does that have to be a theological explanation? No. Could have been designed by aliens. Could have been designed by something in the solar system. It's a legitimate hypothesis, but it's falsely characterized as God did it. You have to. The arguments for intelligent design are not theological arguments. It has theological implications, absolutely, but it's not a theological argument. It's a design argument. It says something is designed or not designed. So you don't want to just reject that out of line. And here's how the logic goes on and why it's a fallacy. Because the intelligent design folks would say materialism cannot explain the universe. So therefore, intelligent design did it. That's a logical fallacy. I mean, anybody can see through that. Evidence against one premise can't be used as accepting the evidence for another premise. That's illogical. Here's how the logic really works. There's a premise. No materialistic causes have been shown to have the power to cause or explain event E. So we see an event E, and we say no materialistic cause has been shown to have the power to cause that. Premise two. Intelligent design has demonstrated a cause for event E. Namely, it's designed. Conclusion, therefore, premise two is the best explanation of event E. But intelligent design is declared unacceptable by the Academy because it has, quote, metaphysical implications, and then falsely branded as religion. Well, you've been to our forums in the past, you know that science has all kinds of metaphysical implications, starting with that the universe is intelligible, that it can be known. We've talked about that several times. And at the same time, the atheistic unproven metaphysical claims such as multi-universe, remember the multi-universe? The multi-universe this isn't the only universe. The mathematics are such that there could be infinite number of universes out there. Scientifically, can you find those universes? Is there any evidence for it? No. Can you even in principle determine something outside that there's another universe out there? No. But it's an acceptable hypothesis because it doesn't have a theological implication to it. Quantum fluctuation. How did the universe come into being? Quantum fluctuation. That's acceptable as a scientific premise. If that's acceptable, why isn't intelligent design acceptable? The second barrier to making advancement in the science-religion debate is what's called non-overlapping magisteria. Stephen Jay Gould, a very famous Harvard evolutionary biologist of past decades, named it this, and he said, I love you guys that like theology. You can go to church all you want, you can go to synagogue or whatever, but when you come here at Harvard to study science, you better be a materialist. And why? Because we operate in different domains. You have operate total different realms of life. They don't even overlap. Metaphysics, which is beyond physics, is totally outside of science. Why is it outside of science? Because we've defined it that way. We've defined it that way. It should stay out there. Science, in fact, science, the real hardcore folks on this one will say science is the only path to real knowledge. Boy, can you imagine humanitarian literature, economists, almost anything that's not science is not really real knowledge? That's arrogance. Here's a diagram of is being talked about here. Scientific knowledge is one sphere, theistic knowledge is in the other sphere, and if you want to know how to go to heaven, you get into the theistic side. If you want to know how the heavens go, you come and study science, but keep it apart. So you can do what you want on Sundays, but Monday when you work, don't bring your ideas about design into the science classroom or the science job. They're different domains. They're entirely different domains. And as long as you stay in your sphere, you're not going to bother me. That's fine. You stay within your boundaries. We shouldn't even be concerned about this until there's an overreach from one into the other domain. Evolution is science, doesn't make any metaphysical claims. Well, we know that's not true, but that's what's being said. Evolution and theism are consistent with one another. Well, they're not really. I'm going to show why they're not consistent with the next objection. And separation of theism and materialism should be legally enforced because it's a church-state matter. So you want to really battle this? You want to bring a lawsuit on this thing? You're going to lose, and it's already been determined. The case log is already against it. So just keep in your side of the street, and I'll keep on my side of the street. But here's the reality. They do overlap in some areas. I mean, you don't need to have a theological implication or a design implication to build a bridge or to figure out how the internet works or anything. But when you get down to the most critical areas of origins and destiny, for example, they do overlap. And they compete and they disagree with one another. How do you resolve that? You just don't arbitrarily say, you stay in your corner and I'll stay in mine. Science says, we just appeal to facts. You, people of design or faith or whatever, you deal with values, opinions, blind faith. We heard Richard Dawkins talk like that many times, that anything that has to do with values or faith is just pure blind faith. As a matter of fact, the dialogue that we saw in the beginning with Nicholson and Morgan Freeman was kind of like that. I just have faith. Now, Freeman said, I just have faith. Now, he didn't give reasons why he believes what he believes. That should be the real dialogue. And Nicholson well, I know the wheels on the bus go round and round. I made my $1 billion and so forth. But that was a great start of a discussion. And that just needed to go farther. It didn't need to be stopped. Science does appeal to metaphysics. I mean, here's a book in my library that just came out a couple years by probably one of the most famous astronomers of our time. A universe from nothing. Laws of nature originated from nothing. Motion originates from nothing. Fabric of the universe, space, time, and matter comes out of nothing. How about Dawkins? Well, yeah, I agree. Dawkins says, I agree with you. Life looks like it has the appearance of design. Designed for a purpose even, but it's an illusion. You're hallucinating. There's no designer behind that. It's all accident. Excellent natural selection. Human consciousness, we talked about that, our self-awareness, that we are our own person, that we have a consciousness that is unapproachable by anybody outside. That human consciousness, that self-awareness is nothing but molecules in motion. Caltech will tell you that. Nothing but molecules in motion. Life has no meaning and purpose. Boy, that really feels good, doesn't it? No meaning and purpose to life, just blind, pitiless indifference. Objective moral values. Well, maybe there are objective moral values, but without a moral lawgiver? Without a moral lawgiver, Hitler and Mother Teresa are the same. Morally equivalent. So anyway, my contention here will be that theistic science gives more consistent explanation than a disconnect between materialism and theism, especially in the areas of overlap. With theistic science, we have a creator instead of I like to ask my, my friends on the other side, I said, well, what happens on day -1 of the Big Bang? Can't ask that question. There is no answer. Why isn't there an answer? Because the mathematics says that there isn't. The mathematics says there isn't? How about the rational brain? Did something come out of nothing? How about there's nothing but matter, molecules in motion? How about a better explanation? Yes, there's physical and spiritual dimension to a human being. Big Bang theology says, or Big Bang methodology says the universe is an accident, just happened. Theistic science says there's teleology. Remember we talked about teleology, that there's end goals and things, that there's design and purpose. That makes, to me, that makes more sense. How about the universe without any meaning and purpose? Blind leads to blind, pitiless indifference, as Richard Dawkins says. I don't know, I see truth, goodness, and beauty out there. That's not going to make me any less of a scientist. It's going to make me more of a scientist to see that. I was reminded, we talked about junk DNA in one of our sessions, where just a few years ago, after they decoded the human genome, and they said, we understand the human genome now, and only 3% of the human genome has anything to do with creating us. 97% is junk DNA, left over from an evolutionary process. 10 years later, that number went from 3% to 80%. It's functional. The DNA is probably functional. It's probably 100%. How about life as an illusion? No, I think life is real. It feels real, and I think I can show scientific evidence for it being real. Here's one that's very controversial, even among people who agree on theistic science. We want to mix evolution and creation. My take on this is they're like oil and water. They don't mix. And why? I'll give you my reasons for why they don't mix. Darwinian evolution is an undirected process. It's random. Random and then subject to natural selection. But the creation process is directed. So how can you have a directed, undirected process? They're opposites. Darwinian evolution says this random variation is really the cause, the sole cause, or the beginning cause of the variety of life. Creation says there's design and purpose to every species. Teleology, we went through that and gave a strong indication of why teleology, which means an end goal, that there's end goals to things. Darwinian evolution, we have accidental outcomes of everything. Accident. Is it accident, or are there goal-oriented outcomes? One points to atheism, one points to theism. Truth is confused. I can't mix the two. So we came to a conclusion. This is our final session of the 2 years of our study here. And that conclusion is, we looked at the evidence. Does it point to a creator? Does it point away from a creator? We've come to a conclusion that there is sufficient scientific evidence to justify the God hypothesis. Now, those of you that are believers, that's pretty simple. We didn't need to go through all this, right? But if you're a skeptic, or you're an agnostic, or you want to change the way the methodological naturalism rules the academy today, you better have some answers on why you believe what you believe. So we think we have enough evidence now to justify the God hypothesis. So starting in October, we're going to take this as a hypothesis, the God hypothesis, and say, how does the scientific evidence support it? And we're going to go through October, talk about the universe. Where did the universe come from? What's the scientific evidence for the universe? November, how did planet Earth get so exquisitely fine-tuned for life? January, how did life originate from non-life? Can you imagine here's a blob of something dead, and then all of a sudden it's alive? How'd that happen? Let's look at the evidence from what the explanations are. February, how did all these varieties of life originate? March, how are we unique as human beings? And then a year from now, wrap up with a session like this on what are your own conclusions. And in the meantime, before the Series 3 begins, and how does the scientific evidence support the guide hypothesis, go to the website. We have 20-some lectures on this stuff, and we'll be publishing 4 more to complete the whole series all the way through section 7. So it's all there.
Now, today's presentation culminates our 7-point investigation into the big question, has science rediscovered a creator? Now, this entire series, some 25 video casts and 15 hours of content, is on the website here. So study that. But the really big question is not the content, it's what are your conclusions from what you've heard and read and studied? What have you learned from this study? What surprised you? What has reinforced in your mind that you already believed? Have you changed your mind on anything based on what you learned? What further things would you like to know? You may be interested in my conclusion, and in the next video cast, number 8, I'll discuss that and tell you my story. But the important thing now is, what are your takeaways? How has this information impacted your life? In the spirit of Socrates' dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. How might you apply this knowledge to improve your life, to improve the world, to improve how we go about doing science? And how might this knowledge be better used to build hope for the future? Now, please check out the next video cast, number 8. What are your conclusions? It's the final presentation in the series. So until next time, keep thinking deeply. Study the material that's on the website. Ask yourself, what direction do you think the evidence points? And then follow the path, wherever it leads you. I'm Stuart Orr.